Thank you, Sami. And thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'm really honored to be speaking to the law faculty at Jamia Millia. And the topic that I was sort of given was courts and caste. And I spent, and well, just to give a little bit of introduction about myself, I'm a graduate of Nalsar. I've done my PCL from Oxford. I've practiced in Delhi for the last, I practiced in Delhi for about 4.5, 5 years. And since then, for the last 6 years or so, I've been associated with the Center for Legal Policy. I'm one of the co-founders. My work has taken me to judicial reform, has taken me to various other issues as well. And currently, I'm based in Bangalore, where a lot of my work is mostly with the state government and issues that the state government is mostly concerned with. But that's it. I keep writing on issues related to judicial reform, society, and other things. I have a monthly column at EPW called Law and Society, and I have another column at Deccan Herald newspaper, which is called Articles of Faith. But for today's purposes, I'm sort of building on about 4 or 5, actually 5 articles that I've written in the last few years, which are sort of relevant, I think, to any discussion on courts and caste. And keep in mind, it's a very vast topic. There is acres and acres of territory to be covered in terms of what how the Supreme Court or any court's approach to caste in India, to discuss how judges approach the issue, to discuss what has been the historical approaches to it, and I think we can fill sessions and sessions of discussion, debate and discussion purely on that. But today, what I want to do, and I don't know if that small piece was a small abstract was shared with you. What I want to do is I want to sort of go through how the judiciary in general, and the Supreme Court in particular, has a particularly casteist outlook, and this comes through. And I want to bring it into talk about this in 3 different lenses. I want to talk about it in the sense of how certain judgments are decided in the Supreme Court, in the sense of what the judges say and what they don't say, tells us about their outlook. I want to look at the history and the trajectory of reservations also in India. Obviously not the full exercise, but an article I wrote looking at the whole 50% threshold that the court has put on reservations. And the third thing that I sort of want to talk about is the composition of the court itself. So when we talk about the court, of course, as any institution is, it's composed of rules, procedures, and also people. But at the end of the day, who are these people? Where do they come from? How they think about things is very much determined by their upbringing, their background, and we sort of see, and this is what I sort of hope to make good on, that the court, when it comes to deciding its own composition, reinforces a certain casteist approach to its own constitution. In terms of the court saying that we will be the domain of Savarna men of a certain background and of a certain level of privilege, is a conscious choice that the court seems to be making, and that sort of might explain why we are seeing the court function the way it has functioned. So, what I hope to do is speak about all these 3 issues over the next 35 to 40 minutes. At the end of the talk, I'll open it up for discussion. And in the middle, if you see me sipping, this is my dinner for today. So, which is why, please excuse me while I take sips of hot and hot and sour soup. But I want to go over about 4 or 5 articles that I have written, and I don't want to take it through them word by word, but I sort of want to use that as a starting point to make the larger argument. So let's start with 2 recent judgments that most of you may be familiar with. I assume all of you are law students who have started off sometime in the last 5 years. Is that correct? In too much detail. So let me talk about we continue to have the Protection of Human Rights Act, which came in as early in the 1950s, but was not found to be sufficiently deep enough. And in the 80s, following a string of very infamous atrocities, because see that this act did not really have enough deterrent effect, so they decided to introduce the SC/ST Atrocities Act, defined atrocities in a certain way, and said that this is a offense designed to humiliate someone and to attack them on the basis of caste. So therefore, some special protection is needed for members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and therefore we passed this law. Now, under this law, it is extremely hard qualities which are the basis for the offense, and if someone is enlarged on bail, under these offences, what you will get is a situation where, because of the other frailties of our criminal justice system, you will be in a situation where this person may be not so keen to pursue this complaint, because if the oppressor is seen walking around freely, you would of course feel terrified of going to court to testify against them or continue the investigation. So the idea here was to prevent a lot of people who are accused of caste atrocities from getting bail. But what you also see is that in a lot of instances, the court has sort of seen whether an atrocity is made out. Now, keep in mind, the typical idea of an atrocity which was kept in mind for this kind of an offense was based in rural areas, was the use of violence and so on. But a far more, and this is subject to, of course, much more detailed research. I think some research has been done by NLS. You see that this is also used in a lot of instances by urban dwelling Dalits to bring up issues in the workplace about humiliation by the superiors and so on. Now, in a lot of cases, what the court does is to see, is an offense made up? And it takes a very narrow approach to this. In a sense, it turns the logic of the act on its head, where it says that, well, of course, since you're removing so many procedural protections for the accused, you're imposing such much higher penalties. Therefore, we're going to place a much higher burden on you to show that the offense is actually made out in the first place before we deny, anticipatory bail under the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, you could possibly question this in the fact of certain cases. You could say that they've taken a liberal view in some cases, not so liberal view in that case. This is something I don't want to go into specifically now, because we'll end up again thinking for it about for 2 or 3 hours. But the law had attained a certain sort of stability where it was accepted that even though bail was going to be harder in the context of SC/ST Atrocities Act cases, anticipatory bail would not be completely ruled out. But what the court does in Subhash Chandra Mahajan case is more interesting. It seems to think that the SC/ST Act exists to be fundamentally misused, right? This is something which is sort of, I wouldn't say unique, but a particular kind of approach that Justice Goel took to not just this particular law, but also your Dowry Prohibition Act and your 498A in the context of domestic violence, where his whole approach seems to be that, all these laws are being violated, these women and all these Dalits are getting too uppity for their own good. We have to sort of pull back against all of this. I'm simplifying a little bit, but I would urge you to read both these judgments. They are hugely problematic in terms of the language in which he uses, in which he sort of talks about these issues. They're problematic in the worldview which informs this, that really law and legal protection should apply equally to everyone, ignoring any actual structural protections. Now, that in itself is a privileged position. That is a position which says that those who already enjoy power in society should continue to enjoy that power. And this is something that comes through very strongly in the Subhash Chandra Mahajan case, where the court reads down the provisions leading to anticipatory bail. Remember, there was no need to do this. This is the court going out on its own limb. It was already established jurisprudence which said that, see if a particular case is made out. Just because somebody's added to an FIR, you don't have to assume that the person was also listening to it. See what their role is. See if they had any particular inkling of this offense being committed. Regular criminal law principles would apply to the grant of anticipatory bail or not in a given situation. But the court went one step ahead. The court went one step ahead and treated this as if, and they say in occasional lines to the contrary, but they seem to think, and this is something that comes through very strongly from the judgment. In the Subhash Chandra Mahajan case, the court seems to think that the only purpose of the Atrocities Act is to be misused. That is to only question the power of the Savarna upper caste men, and that's a bad thing. Now, under the Constitution, that's not a bad thing. The Constitution exists because there is a certain vision of social justice which the Constitution framers had put into place when they created our Constitution, and that is completely ignored by Justice Goel. And that, I think, sort of tells you about how the court thinks about this. Now, you may say this is just the opinions of one judge, and okay, maybe the other guy who was on the bench with him. But I'd urge you to go back and read all the Atrocities Act cases. Behind the very dead and leaden prose that the Supreme Court judges tend to use, see if you can untangle how they approach questions of power, how they approach questions of structural inequalities. Whose side are they really on? Now, technically, you should say, of course, the court is not on anyone's side, because the court, as justice is required to, it is required to be neutral between parties, give them all a fair hearing. That's as far as procedure is concerned. But the law does not necessarily say that the oppressor and the oppressed are on an equal footing when it comes to the oppressor's act of oppressing the oppressed. But the point is that when the law asks you to say this is what the law is trying to do, you can't ignore the law entirely. You can't simply say that all these constitutional principles of social justice and equality and substantive equality should be just tossed out of the water because I, the Supreme Court judge, decide that this is how these things should be decided. Now, the fallout of this was that Parliament enacted a law. You had massive protests by the members of the Dalit community who felt that this particular judgment would open the door for watering down the Atrocities Act as well. Now, there were reasons to fear this because a part of the reasoning used by Justice Goel, it's an example of bad data science, is that they use the fact that very few cases end up in conviction without going into underlying reasons why these cases don't end up in conviction. And this a lot of campaigners felt would be used as further reason to dilute the law, but Parliament, of course, amended it. And then the Supreme Court changed its minds completely, almost in line with exactly what they were told by Parliament to do in the make that amendment, and they recalled this judgment. It's a very controversial recall, a set aside of this judgment, and that is not without its problems. And there are larger issues with the Supreme Court itself as an independent judicial body in the way in which they seem to be taking their cues from Parliament. I mean, not necessarily a bad thing. Nobody's saying that the judiciary and Parliament should always be fighting with each other. But in terms of how they justified changing their mind, it was very problematic. And I've written a different piece on that, but I don't want to go into that for the purpose of the present debate, except to show that this is a case which sort of tells you that the worldview of average Supreme Court judge is still reflecting only that of how do I protect the privileges and powers of the Savarna man in this country, rather than thinking about the larger goals of social justice. And this lens is also what will help you understand the Jarnail Singh judgment. Now, the Jarnail Singh judgment, and I'll move a little quickly here. A little bit of background. The Indira Sahni case had not decided decisively on whether reservations in promotions would be permitted or not, because they had said that yes, they had decided kind of this thing. They had said reservations in promotions would generally not be allowed unless there were exceptional circumstances. Parliament amended that to say yes, reservations in promotions will be allowed. And prior to that, there has been a lot of back and forth in judgments. Now, Parliament had said that reservations would be allowed. Then you got a very controversial judgment in 2007 in M. Nagaraj state of Karnataka. This has been a long pending issue in Karnataka, by the way, and only got resolved last year or year before last. The question being, how should reservations be provided for in promotions? Keep in mind, reservations so far, and there is fair consensus on there should be reservation when it comes to entry-level positions. Like if you're hiring someone for a group A, B, C, D post, you have to give reservations to say, so much for SC, so much for ST, so much for OBC, then horizontal for women, physically disabled, and so on. But should there be reservations when you go up the ladder? When you get promoted to the next level, should there be reservations to say only X percent of general category, only X percent of scheduled caste, scheduled tribe should be promoted? Was a question to be decided. Now, when Parliament had said that there will be reservation in promotion, the Supreme Court and M. Nagaraj did something very strange. This was the basic structure challenge, by the way. The introduction of the provisions in the Constitution, Article 16(4)(a), if I'm not mistaken, which sort of said that there will be that legislature and Parliament can provide for reservations in promotion. What the Supreme Court does is to impose two limits on this, right, as a way of upholding the basic structure validity of this particular clause. Now, this is kind of interesting because these aren't limitations inherent in the Constitution. These are some things that the court comes up with completely on its own. One is that it says that there should be proof of backwardness of the class for which you're giving promotions and reservations and promotion. And two, you have to see if they're adequately represented in the category in which for which they're being promoted to. So if you're saying that in this particular post, out of 100 positions, only 3 are occupied by Dalits, whereas then their nationwide representation, the statewide representation is 20%. You'll have to show that they're underrepresented with vis-a-vis their actual numbers in society, and therefore can give reservation. Now, both these were questioned once again before the Supreme Court in Jarnail Singh, saying that M. Nagaraj had no basis to arrive at this, especially the first, because it has been, and this is what even Indra Sani says, by the way, that it is deemed that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are constitutionally deemed backward. That when the constitution itself provides for very specific ways in which you identify scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, you can't make a further inquiry to find out are they still backward or not, because this goes directly against the constitutional provisions which provide for determining the list, the creation of the list and the precedence orders on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and so on. So this was challenged in the court, and also that adequacy is not necessary. Now, the Supreme Court in Jarnail Singh, this is a judgment of Justice Nariman. What he says is that, of course, that M. Nagaraj was wrong insofar as the first requirement of backwardness is concerned, that when the Constitution deems them backward, of course, there should not be any further need to prove the backwardness of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But on the second requirement, he says, no, you still have to show adequacy of representation. Now, this has had certain downstream effects, and you would have read this recent judgment from Uttarakhand, where they have held that there is no constitutional right to reservation. In fact, that case was kind of misrepresented in most outlets. The true issue in that case was whether the government could take back reservations in promotion without giving reason. So because you had reservation and promotion, some part of it is struck down, then a fresh law was made, and then the government changed its mind once again and said, no, there'll be no reservation and promotion. And somebody challenged that changing of mind, saying that, how can you change your mind once you have said that there is no reservation and promotion? If you read these two judgments, the Jarnail Singh and the Uttarakhand judgment, you get the sense that reservation is no longer seen as something that is essential for social justice. It's by way of charity. And this goes quite contrary to what the Supreme Court has been saying for a long time. In fact, there's a very famous quote of Justice Chinnappa Reddy, whose worldview sort of gets reflected in subsequent judgments also. He says, this is K.C. Vasantakumar versus State of Karnataka, he says that reservations are not for charity, it's about parity, cutting short a lot of things in the middle. He sort of puts reservations in the context of India's complicated social and cultural and economic history, and points out that reservations are not to be treated as something that is the largesse of the state. It is the state fulfilling its mandate of social justice under the Constitution, in that they are a feature of Article 14 itself. That they are not an exception in some way to reservations. But unfortunately, what has happened, that with the Jarnail Singh judgment and with the judgment in this Uttarakhand case, reservations have gone back to being a sense of charity. I wrote about the Supreme Court's atrocities case judgment in first post. I can share the links with you afterwards. And about the Jarnail Singh judgment, I wrote about it in Scroll. But broadly, what these two suggest is that there is a sense that we can't allow social justice laws to fundamentally question the power of privileged Savarna men. And two, things like reservation and the Atrocities Act should be really seen as some sort of charity that the government is doing. That we sort of say, oh, poor things, let's let them enjoy at least these benefits. And not in a sense of giving them expanded scope to achieve their true purpose, which is to ensure a level of parity. We're not talking about some accommodation being made for a certain class of people, but the fact that the purpose of reservation is to allow members of excluded classes to stand on an equal footing with those with more privilege. And these judgments tell you that the court's approach to this issue has become very problematic. The second kind of approach that I want to take is the longer approach of how the courts have thought about reservation itself. Some of you who are constitutional law students would have known that right at the beginning, as soon as the Constitution came into force, there were already reservations, and some states, such as Madras and Mysore, had expanded the scope of reservations to include a lot of other classes. And when first challenged, the Madras High Court struck down Champakam Doyarajan's case. And it prompted a further constitutional amendment to ensure that reservations are constitutionally protected. Now, reservations were largely upheld by the Supreme Court. But for the first time, what you find is that in the 1960s, the Supreme Court, 1950s, the Supreme Court starts introducing a cap on reservation. We started streaming this. I thought we weren't streaming, but anyway, that's fine. Anyway, what this sort of does is to impose a limit on reservations. Now, we've all taken this limit for granted. And those of you who may have just read the headlines of the Supreme Court's recent judgment in Chebrolu Prasad Rao, where they said that 100% reservations for positions of teachers in scheduled tribe areas of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana is unconstitutional, may think, okay, that seems reasonable because after all, the Supreme Court has laid down that a 50% limit needs to be placed. Now, if you actually go back and read, and this is something that I examined I'll just pull up that article in a second. I examined an EPW piece of mine, which talks about revisiting the rationale for reservations. This was in 2016. It was in the context of a lot of demands, agitations for reservations among Jats and other communities. And what I looked at was, and one of the problems then was the fact that this 50% limit that everyone was talking about, everybody traces it to Indira Sahni. But if you actually look back at the history of this particular 50% limit, it was initially introduced in M.R. Balaji versus State of Mysore. And if you actually read that judgment, nowhere does the court say why 50% is an acceptable limit. It's just something that they are sort of going, yeah, we think 50% is okay. Right? You'd think that such an important jurisprudential principle that reservations should not go beyond 50% for any particular group, or all reservations put together should not go more than 50% of the total number of seats or jobs, is something that the court would make more effort in trying to expostulate to say this is why we think so. But if you go back and read M.R. Balaji versus State of Mysore in the Supreme Court judgment, there's almost no reasoning. Likewise in Devdas. But what happens after this is that everybody sort of, when I say everybody, I mean the court, very blindly accepts that, 50% limit, 50% limit, 50% limit. And in Indira Sahni, this is given a stamp by a 9-judge bench in the Supreme Court, effectively making it the law of the land. But nowhere does the court actually go into, except for broadly saying, okay, one possible justification for the court offers, and this is, keep in mind, only in the context of service cases. For those of you who may not be aware, there are broadly 3 kinds of reservations that our Constitution gives. And you have to keep in mind the distinction between these 3 for the purpose of our discussion. There are reservations in schools and colleges, educational institutions, that's provided for under Article 15. There are reservations provided in jobs under Article 16. And there are reservations provided for in seats to Parliament and Legislative Assembly. The 10-year limit that you keep hearing about, Ambedkar wanted reservations only for 10 years, applies only to the 3rd category, which is reservations in political representation. That has been extended every 10 years thereafter. It is not that every single reservation only came with a 10-year time limit. This is something that I discussed in an episode in more detail. I also host the Ganatantra podcast. So we have one episode which was late last year with Professor Gopal Guru. So those of you who are interested in podcasts, go and check it out. We discussed this issue about the misrepresentation or the misinformed nature of the debate on reservations. And you know how misinformed it is when even a Supreme Court judge does not know the distinction between these 3 kinds of reservations. That in the arguments in the Chebrolu Prasad Rao case, Justice Arun Mishra seems to think that this 10-year limit applies across the board to all reservations and not only to political reservations. So keeping that in mind, there is no, so just keeping that in mind, when we come to the reservation when it comes to services, there is at least one limit in the Constitution under Article 316, which says that any accommodation or reservation should be done keeping in mind the efficiency of the service. But again, nowhere does it say 50% and no further. This 50% limit that the court has imposed has now been breached by the parliament amending the constitution for economically weaker sections. And some of you may recall that Arun Jaitley, who introduced this amendment, said, even in the Indira Sahni case, they allowed us to breach it in exceptional circumstances. Now, the exceptional circumstances were never fully laid out. Even in Indira Sahni case, they never really say what these exceptional circumstances were. But we have seen that while the case in the context of Tamil Nadu, which has gone beyond 50%, has never been decided, case after case they have struck down, whether in terms of Muslim reservation, whether in terms of Jat reservations, whether in terms of Gujar reservations. The Supreme Court and the High Courts have struck down reservations which have gone beyond the 50% limit. But this 50% limit, and I repeat, does not find any textual backing in the court's jurisprudence. Is not something that the Constitution provides for, and I would even argue goes against the very idea of what reservations are supposed to do. Reservations are not supposed to be a way of as slow as possible kind of an attempt at social justice. It is about equalizing it. And if the requirement is that you have such a large section of people who are excluded, you don't necessarily say, okay, we'll only allow you to progress at this particular rate and no further. That goes against the very ethos of the Constitution. And it also does not account for the fact that a very tiny section of the population had actually monopolized government jobs, had monopolized access to education, and had monopolized political power. So when you're trying to undo this through the constitutional mechanism, for the court to impose a limit to say reservations shall only be this much and no more, seems to me to be something that an institution which is firmly against social justice, or one which has had varying approaches to social justice, but this one consistent stream that it has been disinclined to allow it to go beyond a certain limit. It's a hallmark. Now, keep in mind, it's not as if every single judge has had the exact same approach to it. There have been judges who have questioned the 50% limit. There have been judges who have been okay with it going all the way up to 100% if required. And even in the Indira Sahni case, they do mention that in particular circumstances in extremely deprived areas. And what is an extremely deprived area but a scheduled tribe area which has not seen that kind of development, and where the students don't get any access to education? Even there, the Supreme Court is unwilling to go beyond the 50% limit. What the Chabrolu Lakshman Prasad Rao case effectively does is to raise the 50% limit, and this is also sort of what Indira Sahni does. It's an almost inflexible one. Now, a friend of mine who sort of follows the court, she's also a lawyer, asked this question to me, and I thought that's a very interesting way to look at it. She said, this court has been so strict about 50%. Do you think that they would apply the same principle when it comes to economically weaker sections of society? And I say economically weaker sections of society, keep in mind it expressly excludes SCs, STs, OBCs, any class which otherwise benefits from reservations. Effectively, the economically weaker section under the Constitution, as per the latest amendment, are upper caste and forward caste, and those who have enjoyed the benefits of all the privilege. It is just that they happen to fall below a certain income threshold. What she asked was, do you think they will apply the same logic in dealing with economically weaker sections, which I would say is pretty much an upper caste quota? They will definitely not. I'm 100% sure that this Supreme Court will never strike down. And you may say, oh, it is because this is a court dominated by the Modi government or anything. I don't think so. I don't think it's particular to taking the cues from a strong central government. This court is structurally not something which understands social justice. When you see the reservations as charity, right, as essentially charity, and when you do charity, you don't give up all your income to charity. You basically say, I'll give like about 10% or up to the income tax deduction, I'll give my income to charity. When you see reservations as charity, you see something that, 50%, another 10%, that's okay. But also you see from the point of view of the forward caste, you see from the point of view of Savarnas, you don't see how important reservations are to scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, Dalits, Adivasi communities. And that informs the way you interpret the Constitution. That informs the way you interpret laws. Coming to the last theme of why, and the answer is to say why. So what I've said so far is to look at a particular moment in time where we see the court interpreting like this, to show that this has actually been the court's approach for a fairly long period of time, going back into history. But also, let's try and understand why. let's not just leave it as this number of judges because they're all particularly someone are exactly like this, right? Because that would be a very reductionist way of seeing it. The more complex argument that I want to make is not just that the cast of judges is accidental. It's not that you get a certain uh, proportion of judges accidentally or in a certain manner because somebody is choosing arbitrarily. What I want to make the claim is that the collegium system and even the prior appointment system to some extent uh, chooses or rather selects for a certain kind of box that you tick rather than the other one. Now, I want to refer to an article that I written in 2016. This looks at the how judges are elevated from the High Court to the Supreme. There are broadly three ways in which a person can become a Supreme Court judge. You are either a High Court judge who has been elevated from the bar. You are either a High Court judge who has been elevated from the subordinate judiciary, or you are a eminent jurist of some sort, right? An eminent jurist also includes senior advocates. So you've had Justice Rohit Nariman, you have Justice Lalit, and you have Nageshwar Rao. You have judges who have served in the subordinate judiciary, like Justice Bhanumati. She's, I think, one of two judges in the Supreme Court right now who actually served in the subordinate judiciary and worked their way to the top. And the rest of them are practicing lawyers who have been elevated to the High Court as practicing lawyers and have become Supreme Court judges thereafter. Now, between getting from the High Court to the Supreme Court, this was in 2016. I don't think the numbers have changed that dramatically. You will find that almost inevitably the Supreme Court is filled, and another paper written by somebody else, which I just happened to review, makes this much more explicit. Supreme Court is filled with so-called lawyer judges. That is, people who were either practicing lawyers for a fairly significant period of time before they became High Court judges, or before they became Supreme Court judges. Now, this shouldn't make so much of a difference. I mean, what is the big deal, right? Either you're from a lawyer background or from a judge background. What should make a difference? From what I saw, and from this was another analysis of the numbers of. So I looked at every single High Court judge. I ordered them by seniority, and I sort of looked at the 100 senior most judges of the High Court, of all High Courts across the country. This is about 600 judges were there when I did this exercise. And what I found was that judges who were lawyer judges, right, those who were elevated from the bar, were elevated at least 7 years earlier. They were in their late 40s, early 50s generally. They were elevated much earlier than the judges who were drawn from the services, that is the judiciary. And this is significant because your seniority is essentially determined on the basis of how long you serve on the bench. So if you're a judge who spends who's going to spend only 3, 4, or 5 years in a High Court, you're never going to be one of the most senior most judges of that High Court. If you are one of those judges who are appointed in your late 40s, early 50s, you're going to spend at least 10, 15, if not 20 years in the High Court in some instances. What this leads to is that, and keeping in mind the collegium system, the 3 senior most judges who are recommending more people to be elevated as judges are almost always lawyer judges. From what I looked at the data in 2016, this is an article in the EPW in 2016, what I find, and it is for the absence of diversity in the higher judiciary, what I found was that of the 100 senior most judges, right, these are the judges who are generally in contention to come to the Supreme Court. Of the 100 senior most judges, only 3 were not lawyer judges. Only 3 were from the subordinate judiciary. Now, if somebody repeats that exercise this year, I'm sure they'll get somewhat similar results, if not even worse. It might even be 100% for all you know. But what this has meant is that you get a certain kind of profile of person who becomes a judge of the Supreme Court. It tends to be a Savarna male who has practiced for so many years, whose father or relative, usually male relative, has been a judge of the High Court or has been a practicing lawyer, and who comes from a fairly privileged background. It's very rare that you get judges who don't have this privileged background. You would see that only 2 Dalit judges have been appointed in the last 20 years, The number was much more in the years prior to that. I think it was about 4, if I'm not mistaken. You hardly find any women, although the number of women has increased. And you find that the judiciary, and this higher judiciary specifically, is nowhere near representative of what the larger population of the country is. Keep in mind, when I said district judiciary, there is one important thing to note about district judiciary. Almost every state has reservations because state judiciaries are under the control of the state government, or at least appointment process. They've all prescribed some level of reservations. This is a project that Bidhi has done, and you can check out the report on this. By and large, even with imperfect filling, of course, even with the fact that you don't sometimes get a lot of candidates through, state subordinate judiciaries are much, much more representative of the Indian character, much, much more diverse than the higher judiciary. In fact, if you see the numbers, as you go higher in the judicial scale, you'll find much lower and lower representation. Now, one answer to this, and it's a fairly convincing answer, was given by Justice Ravindra. This is at a recent conference where the issue of diversity of the judiciary from the perspective of women's representation was raised. And he made the point that, look, what you're seeing is a certain kind of historical lag. That the diversity of the judiciary that you see in the Supreme Court or the High Courts reflects the diversity at the bar maybe 25, 30 years ago. Which is a fair point because the average age of the Supreme Court or the High Court just tends to be in the high 50s, low to high 50s. So you are looking at the cohort which entered practice in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, which was definitely much less representative than it is right now. Many more women, many more people outside the Savarna category have managed to get representation in the bar. And therefore, it will catch up. And he raised the point, it's a valid point. In some states, more than 50% of candidates, selected candidates, thank you, I'll wrap up in the next 2 minutes. More than 50% of the selected candidates are actually women, and he said that over a period of time, this will also change. But what he didn't talk about were the structural reasons against such change. One being that you have, and as I just described, a very narrow pathway for district judiciary. So, in as much as the district judiciary may get very representative and very diverse, this diversity will not move up the ladder because because the final selection process is happening at the hands of largely upper caste privileged men at the High Court and the Supreme Court level. So, it's not just enough to say that, yeah, eventually they'll catch up. They probably won't. They will be held back unless the system of appointment changes quite dramatically. But two, the other stream is not as if everybody has an equal chance of being a lawyer. I can speak from my experience. It is very hard to survive as a practicing lawyer if you don't have enough connections and if you don't have a network within the practicing, within the legal fraternity to help you along the way. This is not just a particularly Indian phenomenon. Let me be clear about this. Because our profession hasn't yet organized like it has in the US and the UK and other countries. Most people either join a senior or start off on their own. And if you read Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, he describes this is exactly what used to happen in the UK about 200, 300 years ago. That nobody will entrust you with a case in your first 3, 4, 5 years of practice. If you're very lucky, if you're from a very good institution, maybe in 3 years you start earning on your own. But you still have to survive, right? There are still 2 years and you have to eat and feed your family or pay off loans and so on. And if you don't have connection and if you don't have access to a senior or a law firm which will help pay your bills, it is going to be very difficult for you to survive in the profession. It's not as if 100 equally talented youngsters join the bar, all 100 will move in step just depending on their ability. Some will survive because they are from a privileged background where they can afford not to earn for 2 years. Some will have caste and other networks within the bar which will give them briefs, will give them retainers, which will give them open doors for them to allow them to survive. But the remaining who have access to neither of these two will not be able to sustain in the profession. And this is why we have what is called a survivorship bias, where if we are seeing a certain kind of person becoming a high court judge, it's because they have survived It's not because of some inherent merit which is choosing these people at some level. When you say merit, right? When judges say merit, what they're really talking about is the survivorship bias. They're only seeing those who survive the brutal requirements of practice at the bar and assuming that this is what it takes to survive, ignoring the fact that there are structural inequalities at play at the bar. So, what I'd like to conclude is to say, to sum up the three main points that I just made. One, we are finding that the courts reflect a certain kind of casteist mentality in the way they write their judgments. Two, the Supreme Court specifically and the higher judiciary in general have had this problem with reservations and social justice measures which sees them more as charity and not for parity. And except for certain times when the outlook changed, the general approach has been to treat it as charity, and that is what we're reverting to. And three, it's a reflection of an institution which creates barriers for people outside a certain very narrow, defined set of categories to enter the profession, to even survive, to be make it to the judiciary. So I would like to leave you with these thoughts. And the next time you read a judgment which concerns caste, or when you see questions of whether the collegium is functioning, or when you see the term merit in the context of the judiciary, I'd like you to think through what these terms mean and how the court is actually approaching these issues, and whether there is a better way to do this, which requires perhaps a fundamental rethinking of how the court is supposed to function. Thank you. I have slightly gone over my time, but I think we still have about 10-15 minutes for question and answers. So, how do we do this question and answers? Will somebody raise questions? Will somebody be moderating the questions and so on?
I guess we can just ask the people to turn on their mics and go on for questions.
Okay, sure. Please, I'd be grateful if you introduce yourselves as you ask your questions.
Hi, Prasanna sir. Vaibhav this side. Uh, Actually, sir, my question is that what's your view on the complexity or intricacy that may arise in case
Okay, I'm sorry, Vaibhav, the question sort of got lost there. What I'd suggest, why don't you just type it out in the chat? Some of the words went missing. Okay, while the next question comes in, there's a great question by Osama Noor on Rajiv Dhawan's submission that there is a need to revise the lists. I will defer to my colleague Anup Surendranath, who is teaching at NU Delhi, who writes about this issue quite a bit. Um, there is a need to rethink how reservation issues are, rather, reservation benefits are distributed within members of the same larger group. When he says larger group, and I mean, say, within the larger category of scheduled caste, how do we determine who gets it most? That is not an exercise for the courts to do. That is not an exercise for the courts to do because they don't have that information. They don't have any idea how reservation benefits, and it's not about trickle down. It's about who should be given priority. And Anup suggests a way forward. You should look up some of his writing, Anup Surendranath. He's written about reservation inter se among groups. So the Supreme Court has held that you can't prioritize, you can't have reservation within reservation. But Anup suggests that there should be a level of prioritization, that you prioritize groups which have not gotten the benefits over those who have. But this was unrelated to the case in the Chebrolu case, and I don't think Arun Mishra even understood what the point that Rajiv Dhawan was making. It's like a I'd like to call this concern trolling, right? In a sense that you're trying to you seem as if you're expressing concern, but you don't really care that much. You know, like how on the internet when somebody raises a "What about this? Don't you care about that?" kind of a question. It's a bit like that. It's not as if that was an issue here, and it's not like there's some clear idea as to how we should move forward. This was concern trolling to try and gut the heart of some resolutions. Second question is from Vibhu Sharma. Complexity that arises in case of a reserved candidate getting selected in the unreserved list of candidates, is it justifiable? 50 ka, but okay. So this is a question the Supreme Court has addressed, Vibhu, and I think I'll see if I can share that judgment. This was in the context of so we used to have two-member constituencies. So up to the 1960s, instead of reservation of seats in certain constituencies, people would be allowed to elect for choose two members for Lok Sabha and assemblies, where one person would necessarily have to be a scheduled caste and the other person can be from the general category. In some instances, both successful candidates were from scheduled caste, and somebody challenged this. The Supreme Court said, and this is what is said: there's a threshold. It is not as if a job or reservations in universities are supposed to be mapped exactly according to population representation. What reservations do is to create a minimum threshold to say at least this much number of people should belong to these categories of people. It's a different matter. We're failing to even meet the minimum threshold. That's how bad the situation is in India. So even if you have 80, 90% of people from say Dalit, Adivasi, or Bahujan categories in a particular selection process, and they get through, that is the idea of the constitution. Because the group that we're talking about, which has monopolized all positions and posts, which is Savarna males, are less than 1% or half a percent of the population. But they have 50% of everything else. So the idea, there's no particular, it's not reservation as such. Just because a category of people have benefits of reservations doesn't mean that when they otherwise qualify on their own, they also are taking over reservations. So that's some clarification that needs to be made, Vibhu. I'll share that judgment of how the Supreme Court explains that reservations are just a threshold. They're not a ceiling, and they're not like a mandatory, this is exactly how much you should get and no further. Okay? So that's one way to address that point that you're making. Any more questions?
Hello, sir. This is Mohammad Yasin. And
Hi, Mo.
okay, so sir, I have two questions regarding the discussion that we are having right now. And firstly, let me tell you that I'm a firm believer that there should be reservation system in a setup like India. So the first question is that what is the rationale behind, what could be the rationale behind having a 50% cap as laid down in the Indira Sahni judgment? Because we haven't had any jurisprudence or any explanation on that aspect. Secondly, how would you justify, in your opinion, merits and effective administration in a system which comes up with a 50% reservation cap? So, sir, could you please just share your opinions on these two aspects?
So, this is something I mentioned briefly, and I'll just take 5 minutes. Once I finish this, I'll get to the next question. It's a good point. One, at least I don't see a rationale, but the thinking of the judges seems to be that reservation is an exception to equality. It is not. The only way to see if your reservations are going against equality is to test it against the requirement of substantive equality. Does this reservation prevent somebody? Does this reservation prevent somebody from accessing rights which they should have been able to? And that is something that the court that does not really make an effort to address it. There is no, and I am also really struggling to see what is the basically 50% limit. It seems to be we don't like it going beyond 50%, so therefore it is going to be that way. The second point, which is about efficiency in administration, this is a term that has not really been understood properly by the courts. And there is actually reservations are against efficiency. There is now research which shows I'm supposed to share that where there is more reservation, there is information. I don't totally forget. But they actually found that in departments of the railways which had implemented reservations better, I think this was Deepak Malgan, if I'm not mistaken, the departments functioned better with there's more reservation. So there is no reason to believe that reservations go against efficiency in any way whatsoever. This is a claim that is completely baseless in fact and also goes against the way in which the constitution is supposed to be interpreted. At most, what they may have said is that you will not say, for instance, if you require somebody to have a BE degree to do a particular kind of job, as a job as an engineer, you will not say a BA will be acceptable, right? Just so that you can get enough candidates to meet a reservation criteria. That the basic requirements need to be met. You may relax. You may say that the person can have 40% as opposed to 50% and so on and so forth. That is not efficiency. That is not affecting efficiency because a 50 or 40% does not actually indicate merit. It just indicates you did well in those exams and that you were capable of doing this job. So we have to understand his efficiency as to broadly mean a qualifications to do the job and not a general suitability for the job at all. Unfortunately, that's not how the Supreme Court has understood it, and unfortunately, that is some of the basis for which this 50% limit is justified. So that's the problem that I've got of reservation is not an exception to equality code. It is facet. Yeah, reflected in another is a facet of inequality just foreign and everything. Yeah, it is a. I agree. It's a facet of equality itself. Reservations are actually a facet of equality itself. And you rightly point to the N.M. Thomas case. Sorry, I think I forgot to mention that case in the middle. That has unfortunately been watered down. That is the thrust of my piece, which I discussed today. It is that the Supreme Court has watered down this belief that reservations are a facet of equality itself, and therefore there is you're retrieving to the position prior to N.M. Thomas, and the court doesn't seem to. I mean, they cite N.M. Thomas. It's not as if they completely forgotten the judgment. They cite it, but they don't really understand what it means, and that is where I bring in the third aspect. You have people with a very limited worldview of how things, how the society is structured and who is favored and who is not, because they are constantly the ones who are getting into the Supreme Court. You don't have this different perspective being brought into equality. Yeah, there are more questions? What are views on creamy layer classification? Do you think it should be applicable to SC and ST? Yeah, Kasan, so just to clarify what I just said, the reservation for 10 years was only for political reservation. It was never meant for education or job reservations. So the 10 years was only for political representation. And the more you see it, the more you realize there is still, you probably need it for 100 years. For the simple reason that there has been another study carried out, I forget exactly where.
Research committee.
Can you just mute whoever that person suddenly, like, there's a lot of disturbance surrounding that. Yeah. Yeah. What I was saying was that, so there was another study which sort of showed that when reservation is removed from a constituency, it doesn't continue to, the representation of Dalits from that particular constituency starts decreasing. So people are only voting for Dalits because they have no other choice. It's not like people are voting for Dalits because they believe in equality and social justice. So until it is possible for Dalits to win on the basis of their ability to be good political leader, and when they're not being judged purely on the basis of their caste, I'm pretty clear we need a political reservation. Also, it should continue until we can see a significant number of Dalits win their seats in parliament and legislative assembly without the help of reservation. Creamy layer classification, again, this is another 10-hour long discussion. It applies only to other backward castes, and it was initially intended. I will recommend a book that everyone should read, and I will try and summarize what the book's argument about creamy layer is, and hopefully it will make sense. The book is called The Flaming Feet by D.R. Nagaraj. He's passed away 20 years ago, but this is by far one of the most incisive books that you will read about caste, society, and India, and politics generally. And I think this, at least I read it in the last year, and it has completely made me rethink a lot of views that I thought I had in life. But the creamy layer, it applies specifically in the context of OBCs, because you're not talking about the rich and the better off OBCs. You're talking about those categories of OBCs which enjoyed political power. Now, this is the point that D.R. Nagaraj makes, which is that initially reservations was to account for the fact that there were some castes which had access to education but didn't have access to political power. And this is true, especially in Karnataka, what's today now Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. You had a lot of castes who were slowly getting educated, but realized all the jobs were being reserved for Brahmins. So therefore, they made the first demand for reservations. Now, for these castes, which have maybe 2 or 3 generations of access to political power and education, it is definitely necessary to say the priority should be given to those castes which are not, say, Dalits or Adivasi groups, but also those who lost out very badly in the context of industrialization. D.R. Nagaraj talks about these castes as the ones which had, the weaver castes, the ones which were involved in the trades, the ones which were involved in a lot of day-to-day industrial work, who simply lost their jobs and India became an industrialized country. So therefore, what he suggests is that these castes should be given benefits over those castes that have already enjoyed the benefits in the past. So creamy layer makes sense when you talk about the inclusion of Jats, inclusion of Gujars and other communities which have enjoyed a certain level of political and educational power, but not in the context of those who have had neither educational nor political power in the past. So therefore, this applicability of creamy layer does not happen at all in the context of SCs and SC. But I am doing a very poor job of explaining a great argument which D.R. Nagaraj makes. I would please recommend that you all read this fantastic book called The Flaming Field. Okay, there's a question by Danish on, in relation to structural discrimination within the judiciary, what kind of reform would you like to suggest without compromising independence of the judiciary? Danish, I like your belief that there is still an independence of the judiciary, but okay, I won't be that cynical also. I believe that we need a judicial appointment commission, and the judicial appointment commission should not just be judges and the government. It should primarily be members of civil society and people outside government, along with members of government, along with judges. I'm not saying in the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years we'll get dramatically different appointments. But I do think that once judges realize that they have lost their monopoly over appointments, and to retain independence, they need to figure out people who are independent within the judiciary to put forth the best candidates as opposed to the candidates who are likely to the line. I think then we will start seeing the difference. And unfortunately, this was not even the vision in the National Judicial Appointments Commission, which was proposed in 2014 and was passed very unanimously. It was a very bad idea, very poorly structured, would solve no problems. It was just to try and get the government to be part of the collegium system. So I don't think that was a reform at all. A real reform would be something like what I have suggested. And I'm all in favor of reservations within the judiciary. It can be at the larger high court level. Maybe Supreme Court may be difficult to implement because a much more limited number of seats. But I think at some point there's a need to talk about reservations at the high court level because you have more than 1,200 positions in the high court. And it can't continue as is being done because you're not able to fill up the seats and you're also not representing enough people and there's no diversity. So I would think that is what needs to be done. Purva, I think I also addressed part of your question about what should be done to increase representation in the courts. One simple step, and this is something that they can do tomorrow, start appointing more judges from the subordinate judiciary. Start saying that we'll appoint younger judges as long as they're good. We are seeing a lot of very talented young people join the subordinate judiciary in the last 10 years or so who have graduated from law schools and eminent institutions like Jamia Millia. And I think they should be given a chance to move ahead. They shouldn't have to stand and wait in the queue just because seniority and a certain kind of casteist mentality to who's a good judge should be allowed to stand in the way. Just appoint more judges on the subordinate judiciary, you'll get a much more representative judiciary. Apart from, say, thinking about the long-term changes to how do we ensure that the bar itself is represented? In as much as we're worrying about representation of the judiciary, I think at some point, this is going to have to enter in the discussion, how do we make sure that the Indian bar at the higher level, like who survives in the profession, gets to be more representative, and that is not happening. Vibhu has two subordinate questions. Vibhu, since I've answered a question, I'll just wait if there's anybody else who has a question, and I'll then come to your questions. These are two very interesting questions, by the way, but I'll just see if anybody else that I give everyone a chance to ask a question before the time is up. Okay. Since nobody else has asked a question, Vibhu has asked, is it reasonable to earmark reservations as per demographics and population composition in a particular place? Very difficult question to answer. And I don't, I mean, in the context of public sector jobs, this is constitutionally provided for certain areas. For example, Telangana has had this for a very, very long time. Likewise, the northern part of Karnataka called Kalyan Karnataka, and also in hill areas. It is hard to make a general principle, but I would say that demographics and population composition of a particular place should only be in the context of underdeveloped parts of the country, like hill areas and so on, and two, tribal areas where it is not going to be. You don't want tribal peoples to feel that the rest of the country are colonial rulers, where all the jobs are taken up by people in the plains, all the economy is controlled by the people in the plains. You don't want them to get that impression, and you want tribal people to have an opportunity to compete, at least for these kinds of jobs, so that eventually the community comes to the mainstream at its own pace. So that is an important thing to keep in mind, that you can't make a very general statement with this regard. It has to be somewhat contextual and somewhat specific. Is it justified in terms of the previous question that I answered? I think it is entirely justifiable. I think in terms of reservation policies, only about maintaining a certain level of threshold. And if any particular recruitment process actually reflects India's diversity, I'd more than welcome it, irrespective of whether it is 80% of reserve candidates or 90% or 10% of reserve candidates. It has to reflect at some level. I mean, that will tell us. The point is not to reserve. The point is not to reserve a certain number of seats for X, Y, or Z. The point is to say, is this a truly equal society? Your caste doesn't matter whether you get this job or not. It does. That, and not just at the point of you applying for the job, whether you're even able to get to that level of qualification where you even cross the threshold for that job. I think that is what the question we should be answering for, rather than looking at the percentages of people who get through and the percentage of people who don't get through. The real question is, are scheduled castes and scheduled tribes competing on an equal footing with the upper caste or Savarnas for jobs in education institutions? The answer is still no. And if for some cycles they go slightly above 50%, that is not necessarily a bad thing, because the larger goal still remains unmet. Okay, I think that was it.
I think if anyone has any questions, please feel free. Like,
Yeah.
I guess in 5 minutes we'll wrap up.
More questions?
Hello, Mr. Prasanna. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just want to ask you one question. That you made a observation that in the lower judiciary it is more democratic and there are a lot of reservation.
I mean diverse, not democratic, not necessarily diverse.
Yeah, so diverse and compared to in the high courts of the Supreme Court. So do you think that the one reason could be that there are public examinations through which people come through, and you require that kind of examination at the higher level as well?
I completely agree with you on the first part. It's something that I mentioned, because a lot of states have had control over the appointment process. They have said, one, it will be through examinations, and two, there will be reservations. Now, for High Court judges, I'm not so sure if, I personally don't think examinations are the best way, but at least they still are a better way than picking and choosing. That much I'll say. I won't say they're necessarily the best way. I think it has to be much more complex, much more nuanced way of hiring, but at least they're a much more fair way of hiring judges than what is followed in the High Court and the Supreme Court. But I do think at some point, at least for the High Court, right? Forget about the Supreme Court for the moment. At least for the high courts, we have to seriously start this conversation about, is it time to say at least 50% of judges of the high court should be some combination of Dalits, Adivasis, Bahujans, and women, and other excluded groups, not to say that any others don't deserve it. But I think in some way we have to start the conversation, because the Supreme Court, or at least the judiciary, the higher judiciary, is getting further and further alienated from the larger section of the population, that I think. And there are serious questions to be asked about the credibility of the judiciary itself in this present day and age. And there's something that they'll have to grapple with at some point. But that's a good point I think we'll have to consider. I mean, Judges in the UK are required to apply. They're supposed to send their CVs. Everyone can see their CVs. Everyone can see their list of achievements. They have to undergo an interview process. Why shouldn't we have that for our judges? Maybe examination is not the best way, but maybe we have to.
I'm not saying that the examination is the best way. I'm just saying that could be that is one of the reason that you have more diversity in
I
the.
agree. On that
Yeah.
point, I agree. On
Yeah.
that point, I agree. Okay.
So I guess
So,
with this, yeah.
I have just one last question, if I can just ask.
Sure.
So the last question that I would be asking is, do you think that All India Judicial Services examination would be something which would actually bring a change in the higher judiciary with respect to caste system and the representation in a much better way?
As long as the All India Judicial Service is, I mean, see, this will require a constitutional amendment. I'm not talking about the AIJS which is mentioned in the constitution. That's a bad idea. That solves no problem. It causes 10,000 no problems. And I have also, and there's a good suggestion made that maybe at AIJS should be at a high court level where maybe 33% of high court judges are appointed through this. When anyone can get an exam, and if you clear the exam, subject to age and other requirements, you can be appointed a high court judge in any part of the country. 33% of judges should be promoted from the district judiciary, and maybe 33% of judges can be lawyer judges, as we discussed. Maybe that's the way to think about it. That might be a good way forward. But I think we are not having these conversations. We're all stuck in the, should this guy have been elevated? Why was she not made a high court judge? Oh, what about this particular person? That doesn't get us anywhere. I think it is not just about whether collegium good or bad. It's about what appointment system gives us a judiciary that is genuinely independent, genuinely democratic and diverse, and genuinely reflective of India's larger society.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. That answered my question. Thank you.
I think with this, we can end this session, sir.
So,
We are really thankful.
I hope all of you, and I hope I didn't bore you for too long.
No, sir, we are really delighted to
I
like.
think I've gone slightly beyond my
It
time.
was really an insightful session, and we are really happy, sir. And thank you so much
Sure.
again.
Hopefully, yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you all for inviting me, and I will send across the list of readings. Please, whenever you feel time and if you find time, and now I suppose you have a bit of time also on your hands, do read through some of this stuff. It's fascinating and will hopefully give you something to think about in the context of casting reports.